You want to talk about Spider-Man? Fine. We'll talk about Spider-Man. This has always bothered me, and I think I finally figured out why. Let's see here. That'll work. Lots of comic book characters get adapted and readapted into different versions, and oftentimes there's some overlap, usually in the cliff notes of the origin story and in the overall cast of characters. But Spider-Man has exhibited a unique phenomena. On top of the usual slew of cartoons, movies, alternate comic runs, and novels, Spider-Man will see one very specific story from his history be adapted and readapted time and time again. This is the black suit, Venom, the symbiote. It's pretty odd to consider. Why this, of all the stories to pull from, even the well-known ones like the death of Gwen Stacy or If This Be My Destiny? The symbiote arc gets so much attention from fans and creators alike. As soon as a new adaptation of Spider-Man crops up, it's as if folks are waiting with bated breath to see him get some black goop on him and then rip it off inside a bell tower a few days later. But there's a funny thing about this story. It's kind of a mess. Structurally, it's always kind of been a mess. Clearly a compelling mess. Definitely an endearing one. But a mess nonetheless. The origin of this story arc reveals that it was hardly a clear creative vision originally. In non-fiction reality, Marvel held a contest allowing fans to submit story ideas for comics, and a fan named Randy Schueller submitted this idea for Spider-Man to have a stealth suit made of unstable molecules. The bigwigs at Marvel liked the vibe of his artwork, and they tried to work with Schueller to develop the idea further, but it ended up falling through. Until a few years later, when the general design of the suit was palette swapped for a merchandising deal involving a huge crossover event called Secret Wars. Among the community, rumors had begun to spread about Spider-Man getting a new costume, and due to release schedules, the black suit ended up appearing in the main run of Spider-Man comics before its origin could be explained in Secret Wars number 8. The abrupt change caused some stir with fans. People didn't like it, so there was an instant pressure to get Spidey back in his reds and blues. The writers decided to acquiesce, but they didn't want to get rid of the black suit until the run of Secret Wars was finished and everything could be explained properly. This meant they had a few months and a handful of issues to give Peter a good reason for taking the costume off. So they came up with the idea that the suit was not only alive, but sentient. However, interestingly, in the original run of Spider-Man comics, during the stretch of time that Peter is wearing the black costume after Secret Wars, it doesn't make him stronger, and it doesn't affect his behavior either. It's really mostly helpful to him as a costume. The initial idea was to give Peter a modest upgrade, and a suit that could shapeshift and self-heal seemed like an obvious move for a character like Spider-Man, who was constantly layering his suit under his street clothing and hand-sewing it back together after a nasty fight. When they decided to make the suit sentient, they also made it capable of doing things that Peter didn't explicitly decide to do, like shoot a web out of reflex or reveal his face when the situation called for it. But even when it acted outside of his orders, it was always to his benefit. The writers intended the suit to be alive from the beginning, but they called it a symbiote, which meant its role in Peter's life was intended to be mutually beneficial. People have symbiotic relationships with their pets. Symbiotic relationships in nature are often between a more complex life form and a simpler one. So the black suit originally wasn't designed to cause trouble. It was a good deal. The only worrisome behavior that the suit began to display after the writers decided it was sentient was that it would sometimes take control of Peter's body to patrol the city while he slept. This all came to a head in issue 258, 6 issues after the Black Suit's first appearance. In this story, Peter has a pretty on-the-nose nightmare in which the black costume and his red one fight over him. While he sleeps, the black suit once again takes him out web-swinging, but this time he notices, and he takes the suit to Reed Richards, who then runs some tests on it and informs Peter that it's alive, and it's been trying to form a deep symbiotic bond with him. Spider-Man freaks out and tries to rip the thing off, but it refuses to let go of him, so Reed Richards blasts it off with a sonic gun. It manages to escape the Fantastic Four headquarters and tries to bond with Peter again, resulting in the iconic bell tower sequence we all know and love. And that's it. The entire Black Suit arc until Venom shows up 4 years later. A few things stand out when looking at this original version of the Black Suit story. For one, the suit has no emotional effect on Peter. It also doesn't explicitly seem to enhance its powers beyond its usefulness as a shape-shifting costume. The symbiote tries to help Peter by overriding his bodily autonomy, the main instances being the nightly patrols while Peter rests. But even on these patrols, it doesn't do anything that Peter wouldn't do. It isn't overly violent or aggressive with criminals. It genuinely does its best to be Spider-Man while he sleeps. And even after Peter rejects it and has Reed Richards blasted off of him, the symbiote doesn't return to Peter with malevolent intent, it just misses him. After he removes it for the second time in the bell tower, he is knocked unconscious from shock and exhaustion, at which point the symbiote moves his body to safety and then simply slinks off into the darkness. Even 4 years later, when the symbiote is being worn by Eddie Brock as Venom, it is explicitly stated that Eddie is the one that is homicidally angry at Spider-Man. The symbiote still loves Peter. It's just been forced to bond with an abusive and delusional partner in order to survive. No wonder Venom doesn't trigger his spider sense. The symbiote doesn't want to harm him. The narrative that is more closely adapted whenever the Black Suit enters a Spider-Man story is actually the one from the 90s animated series. Here, we see the suit have a much more tangible effect on Peter's mood and behavior. It was a logical optimization of the story. If the suit makes Peter act like a jerk, he's more likely to notice and take it off. In the comics, he wore the costume for months. In the cartoon, it was only a matter of days before he rejected it, because by that time, it was already making him feel incredibly angry. The other benefit to writing the symbiote as a corrupting and powerful force is that it makes it feel all the more potent as a villain once it's bonded with Eddie Brock to become Venom. It also helps the story make a bit more sense from a characterization standpoint. Spider-Man generally isn't one to perform sonic torture on a complex life form just because it gave him the ick. The main weakness of this original comic run is that the writers need to bend Peter's character a bit in order to get him out of the costume and appease the angry fans in a reasonable time frame. So why then did the 90s series revisit the Black Suit in the first place? If it only appeared in a handful of issues, it probably should have fallen into Spidey obscurity, like the Grinning Gibbon or the Mind Worm. Only it wasn't just worn for a few issues. By the time Secret Wars had run its course, those same angry fans had grown to love the Black Suit. And so, despite the events of the Symbiote saga, Spider-Man was given a cloth version of the costume by Black Cat not long after. So, whenever the artists got tired of drawing the web patterns on his red and blue costume, they would throw him into the black suit for an issue. This went on for 4 years until Todd McFarlane became the lead artist on Spider-Man. The madman actually enjoyed drawing all those extra lines and preferred not to draw the black costume. So they used the appearance of Venom as an excuse for Peter to ditch the look for good. Mostly. The black suit design had grown on fans so much in those 4 years that it left a lasting impression. So it was an obvious inclusion for the 90s series. And the popularity of Venom incentivized his inclusion in Spider-Man 3. Then the Ultimate Comics followed suit, and then Spectacular Spider-Man, and after that, the Spectacular Spider-Man TV series, and then Sony did Venom without doing Spider-Man first, followed by the 2017 animated series, and most recently, Marvel's Spider-Man 2. But if all of these adaptations are just reworking versions of the story that came before, and the first version of the story was something of a rush job, how does one establish a proper baseline for a symbiote tale? There are 3 primary pillars that writers seem to use when tackling the black suit arc, and they're all pretty obvious. Number 1, the black suit makes Peter stronger. Number 2, the black suit affects Peter's mood and/or decision-making. Number 3, the black suit gets rejected and bonds to someone else to become Venom. The problem with this is that it effectively reduces the symbiote to a regular villain that Spider-Man happens to wear around for a little while. It applies pressure to him and complicates his life until he gets pushed a bit too far and then finds the nearest church bell. The audience knows where things are going from the very moment that the black ooze bubbles out of a crater or sticks to the side of a spaceship. One could argue that the symbiote is an effective tool for exploring Peter's dark side, but it sort of isn't. It's a shirt that turns people evil. Drop any superhero into one of these versions of the symbiote, and not much changes. The only room for flexibility is how the shirt turns Peter evil. Maybe it makes him feel extremely cool and impulsive. Maybe it gives him an anger management issue, or maybe it makes him feel constantly frustrated and standoffish. The only things the symbiote reveals about Peter is that he has the willpower to overcome a very ill-defined form of thought manipulation, as long as there's a loud enough sound nearby. The Insomniac games make some attempts to break the mold that this story has fallen into. It ties the symbiote more closely to its contemporary lore as part of an alien hive mind. It makes use of the supporting cast as the main vehicle for getting Peter out of the black suit instead of him just realizing and doing it himself. And it blends the story with Kraven's last hunt to make it feel a bit less like going through the motions. But even then, it still adheres very closely to those 3 narrative pillars. It makes no attempts to question them, but for a symbiote Spider-Man story to feel fresh and interesting, those pillars need to be challenged, because it's not 1994 anymore, and superhero stories have become a lot more thoughtful. It's like trying to make a joke funny when everyone knows the punchline. Ambiguity is a really powerful tool in storytelling. Some of the most enrapturing narratives deliberately use ambiguity to maintain interest. It's the less is more approach. By withholding information from the audience, a story can feel like a dialogue instead of a lecture. The black suit is usually an alien. In fact, it's completely otherworldly in its anatomy. In the comics, Peter is constantly speculating on the thing and reeling from the sheer uniqueness of it while he has it on. Sometimes it's a liquid, sometimes it's a fabric, it can take commands through telepathy, it can shapeshift into street clothing, it even does chemistry on the fly to make a substance almost identical to his webbing. Even by superhero standards, this thing is weird. But in other versions, all of this curiosity tends to be glossed over in the interest of getting Peter to recklessly embrace the costume wholeheartedly, so he can then be completely flabbergasted by the negative effects that the audience has been anticipating from the get-go. In Spider-Man 3, Peter brings a sample of it to Kirk Connors, who tells him that it is a completely undocumented substance that appears to be alive and displays the properties of a symbiote. This is an earth-shattering discovery. Any academic university would be foaming at the mouth to publish this, but he delivers the information with less enthusiasm than he seems to have while giving a standard physics lecture. Then he silently makes several wild inferences in order to then tell Peter that wearing it around is probably a bad idea, just in case anyone in the movie theater was confused, thinking that it was just a standard RIT clothes dye that Peter accidentally spilled on his costume while he was taking a nap. These stories really go out of their way to disambiguate the black suit, but not by explaining it or investigating it, but by giving the characters a borderline delusional air of calm about it. In two of the earliest, most foundational versions of this story, Peter just walks away after removing the symbiote in the bell tower. He just throws some blinders on and assumes that slithering off his body means the same as dead. Then he has the audacity to be surprised when Venom shows up not long after. This is all to say that while these retellings all have their merits and clearly do their best to build upon one another, what this story really needs is a somewhat foundational overhaul. One that goes beyond turning the symbiote into a lab experiment or giving the black suit to Harry Osborn. The Spectacular Spider-Man is often cited as the best symbiote arc, but to its credit, all it actually manages to do is borrow elements from what came before and compellingly squish them together. The symbiote arc has become a feedback loop of only serviceable ideas, and that's stifled it from becoming more. Time is almost always of the essence in superhero stories, and this has been true of the symbiote arc. There is an unspoken hurry to get to the good part, which most people seem to agree is Venom. The Ultimate Spider-Man comics put Venom on the cover of the issue that Eddie Brock first appears in, even though he just meets Peter for a friendly cup of coffee in the story. Then they have him eating janitors as Venom, only 3 issues later. That's very edgy, very dark, but also deranged from a pacing standpoint. The original run had its issues too. It only slipped in tiny single-panel hints that the suit was alive in otherwise unrelated stories, but at least in this way, it allowed tension to build. One could argue that if the black suit had turned into Venom after only 3 issues originally, it would have made for a much more forgettable story and villain. Venom was the culmination of almost 5 years of curiosity and ambiguity, which is part of what made him such an intimidating nemesis. The symbiote itself was also a much more puzzling moral dilemma for fans in its original context. The idea that it loves Peter and sincerely wants to make his life better is quite compelling. Any difficulties that arose from this, like Peter feeling exhausted or the general issue of bodily autonomy and consent, were much more difficult to unpack. It felt more authentic to the idea that this thing is an alien. It doesn't know why it's important to be physically resting while you sleep. It doesn't understand individuality and free will in the same way that human beings do. It wouldn't consider consent because it's never met a person before. Does that make it evil? Not really. Does that make it bad for Peter? Maybe. That's a hard question to answer, especially if Peter is being written as the introspective and considerate character that he most often is. So how should something that can only understand Peter's emotions behave? Maybe it deletes the messages in his voicemail because it's bad news and it doesn't want him stressed. Maybe it tries to protect him by doing something extremely drastic in a moment of fear, like slicing off a villain's hand in self-defense. Not because it's an evil mastermind that wants to gaslight Peter Parker into becoming a supervillain, but because, just like any other creature, it's designed to survive in nature, and it doesn't fully grasp the concept that someone in Peter's position would willingly embrace difficulty and stress in the pursuit of the greater good. The symbiote struggles to understand the somewhat masochistic exercise that being Spider-Man is. There's so much more potential to a black suit that tries to form a true symbiotic bond with Peter Parker, rather than a parasitic one. Because Peter is a terrible person to maintain a balanced personal relationship with. He's chronically running late and forgetting to pick up the eggs and jumping out the window instead of being a good shoulder to cry on. Watching the symbiote try and fail to be his companion would actually say something unique about Peter Parker as a superhero. It would showcase the way that he interacts with something that is evolutionarily designed to improve his life, and how even that creature, with the best of intentions, would slowly erode his ability to be an effective Spider-Man. This is a version of the story that would make it feel distinctly like a Spider-Man story, because to a different hero, the symbiote would be a welcome help. It wouldn't be a problem at all. The original introduction of the black suit does very nearly manage to tell this more nuanced version of things, and it only falls flat because the writers portray Peter as becoming completely disgusted by the symbiote the moment he learns it's alive, at which point he does nothing but try to remove it and keep it off of him at all costs, which feels like an exaggeration to what was essentially productive sleepwalking. The separation between Peter and a more helpful symbiote can still feel violent and messy and painful looking, but not because the symbiote is spiteful or malevolent, but because it needs Peter to survive. It's genuinely terrified at the prospect of facing this alien world exposed, vulnerable, and alone. Sure, it's neat when the symbiote turns into a thrashing devil, but imagine if it was begging to stay. If it looked afraid and it didn't understand why any of this was happening. Then maybe that fear fuels Venom's vengeance. In most versions of the story, the symbiote enjoys being bonded to Eddie Brock. Their goals are aligned. They want to hurt Peter. But in the comics, the symbiote doesn't like Eddie. Eddie is psychotic and abusive, and typically angry beyond reason. The symbiote bonds with him to survive. It's a victim of trauma. It would be fascinating to see a Venom like that adapted into a movie or animated series. A villain that is sympathetic in a very unique way. The audience would root for the symbiote in contrast to whatever morally corrupt individual it was bonded to. People are scared of their own shadows, the whispers in the back of their minds that say awful things, the intrusive thoughts and the selfish impulses. But the thing is, everyone has them. The human conscience requires conjecture. Without the devil over one shoulder, the angel would have no one to argue with. Impurity is part of free will. It isn't a flaw or a nightmare to wake up from. It can't be eradicated from the soul by the echoes of a church bell. The symbiote shouldn't be a manifestation of Peter's dark thoughts because, despite what absolutist comic book morality will tell you, being angry at homicidal supervillains and wishing them dead from time to time is not unhealthy, nor is it particularly interesting. What's interesting about Peter Parker is that, from his point of view, almost any form of self-care is immoral. He will feel guilty for collapsing into bed after a 12-hour day of non-stop work. He will skip meals, forget to do his laundry, even avoid going to the hospital if he thinks that'll take too much time. Being Spider-Man is good, and anything that he wants to do instead of that is bad. Peter should reject the black suit because it can't take care of someone who refuses to let go of their own burdens. The symbiote isn't a steroid. It isn't mind control. It's not even a dark double. It's an alien puppy that came to Earth with the human it fell in love with, only to find that that human was too busy, too broken, and too important to love it back. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned.